Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. I am Joel Chasnoff coming to you right now from Israel. I'm back in Israel after a 2.5 month tour in North America, which means that I can bring you a little bit of perspective about Israel from being here myself. For the past 2 months, I've had to rely on all the conversations I've had with family and friends and any connections I have in the army and the media here. But now that I'm back, that affords that certain personal angle, which I'm happy to bring you again because I know that is what you tune in for. It is April 18th, 2024, and the title of tonight's episode is Who Knows 133 in retrospect. This title, Who Knows 133, is, as some of you probably know, play a connection on the well-known song that we sing at our Seder, Who Knows One, where we go from 1 to 13 and Countdown. It's one of my favorite Seder songs. It is the quintessential Passover song that so many of us know. But really, I think the most important number this year as we go into our Seders is 133. That is the number of hostages who are still in Gaza. And in terms of bringing you perspective on what Israelis are thinking about and talking about right now, this is what Israelis are speaking about. How to commemorate the Passover holiday, how to make Passover what it is supposed to be while we have our own brothers and sisters still being held in Gaza. So this is an extremely difficult question for, I think, for Jews around the world, but especially for those of us here in Israel. As you know, Passover has four names. It's the holiday of springtime, the holiday of Matzah, Chag HaMatzot, Pesach, Passover, but also Chag HaAviv, springtime, and Chag HaCherut, Chag HaFreedom. Passover is a holiday of freedom, and it seems contradictory to so many of us to be celebrating this holiday of freedom when we literally are not free. And so Israelis are trying to navigate this very murky line between giving our children the Passover we want them to have, continuing on the traditions of having the Passover Seder, but at the same time acknowledging this truly unprecedented situation. And I think it brings to mind the idea that so often we do the Seder and we don't do it rotely, but it doesn't resonate as personally as we go through the Seder. This idea that everyone, ki'ilu hu yatsa mitzrayim. There's this idea that everyone at the Seder must tell the story of the Exodus as if he or she themselves were actually in Egypt. It is supposed to be personal, and yet there's a limit to how personal we can actually feel when doing the Seder. But this year, it is very personal. And at the end of this broadcast, toward the end, I'm going to share some ideas that I have for how we can remember the hostages and acknowledge them at our Passover Seders and make their plight part of our discussion at the Seder table. But this is by far the number one thing that Israelis are talking about right now. How do we celebrate the holiday of freedom when those among us are not free? I should also add that another thing Israelis are beginning to really speak about is a sense of possible failure. I think we're looking backwards and wondering, did we miss opportunities? How did we get to the point where we are now at Passover and the hostages still are not free? I think most of us expected that by this point the hostages would be out. I don't think many thought that we would go over 6 months, that we would reach Passover, and that the hostages would still be there. Hostages themselves, who have been released, said that they thought that within 3 or 4 days, they would either be rescued by the Israeli army or there would be some sort of deal cut to release them in exchange, probably for Palestinian terrorists who are in Israeli jails. But in everyone's collective consciousness, we were expecting that within certainly half a year, the hostages would be out. And a lot of us Israelis now are wondering what happened? How did we go this far? And we still have 133 hostages there, especially after that first negotiation occurred where so many came out, elderly, a lot of the children, a lot of the women, though not all. We thought that this was the first of a few deals that would eventually lead to the release of everyone. And I think a lot of us are shocked that it hasn't happened yet. And that twin feeling we have at the same time is sort of a realization that a lot of us don't want to say out loud, but that we are feeling is that it looks more and more likely that the remaining hostages may not be released at all for various reasons. One is that Hamas has rejected every deal that Israel has offered. And the deals we've offered have been pretty much what they've asked for. And then when we present what they asked for and say it's legitimate, Hamas actually ups their demands, changes what they want, and rejects the deals. So a lot of it is simply our realization that Hamas is not going to accept any deal at all. The one thing Hamas has said in all of their responses is that we need a complete war, a complete end to this war, and all of Israeli troops out of Gaza. But they're also saying that even if that were to happen, they're not sure they could locate most of the hostages at this point. The most recent response Hamas offered is to release a mere 20 living hostages. And that sort of sends the signal that they don't know where the rest of these 133 are. When we say 133, by the way, it's with acknowledging that at least 34 of those most likely are, well, 34 of those are confirmed dead. And the large belief is that 70 of the hostages at most are alive at this point. But more and more, we're beginning to think that that number is even lower, and we have to wonder how many living hostages could actually come out right now. Hamas has said we could not even find 40 hostages to meet the first criteria of women and elderly and sick to release, that they just simply don't know where they are and don't even have that minimal number of 40. So I think it's occurring to a lot of us that it's very likely that hostages will not come out at all. And with that is that question, where did we go wrong if we went wrong? Did we go about this in a way that we shouldn't have? Should we have made releasing the hostages the number one priority as opposed to defeating Hamas militarily? All along, most Israelis have said that defeating Hamas is the number one goal of this war. And at the same time, the other goal is to release the hostages. But most Israelis have felt strongly that hostage release would come about through military pressure, through a dismantling of Hamas. Very few have said that we should stop the war or not fight the war and simply negotiate some sort of deal to release the hostages. For the simple reason that the idea of leaving Hamas intact in Gaza, so close to us, right next to us, is untenable. That we cannot have this terrorist organization living literally miles away from the Israeli border. They've promised to carry out more October 7th style attacks in the future. We can't have that. So dismantling Hamas isn't just an act of revenge. It is really for our safety that we cannot have Hamas existing on our borders in Gaza. And yet at the same time, I think we are realizing now that clearly military pressure has not brought about the release of hostages the way we thought it would. And some of the other factors that we're seeing right now, there's a pretty well-known photograph going around Israel, a few photos and video, I don't know if it's making it to the US, of Gazans playing volleyball on the beach this past week. There was a very hot day here in the Middle East, and Gazans in central Gaza flocked to the beach, and there are pictures of them swimming and playing volleyball. And this, so contradicts the image being sent around the world that Israel is starving Gazans by withholding aid, that there's a humanitarian crisis, and that we are committing acts of genocide, those narratives that are going around. So, a lot of one of the big questions Israelis have is what motive would Hamas even have at this point to release hostages? If they're able to go to the beach, if all the aid they need is now coming in because of the pressure being put on Israel, if really the war is over. For all intents and purposes, it does feel like the war in Gaza has ended. We're still waiting for this big Rafah operation, which I do believe will happen. But we've been told it would happen as far back as March, and so far we're going on the 6-week mark of when it was supposed to occur, and it still hasn't. So it doesn't seem like there's any reason for Hamas to capitulate. There is no pressure that would make them want to release the remaining hostages. There was a shocking interview that came out this past week on Israeli TV of two hostage negotiators. So, two negotiators on the Israeli team did an anonymous interview on Israeli television. This is one of those interviews where they blur out the faces and they change the voice to a very strange robotic sounding voice to hide the identity of the negotiators. And what these two negotiators said is that Netanyahu has been sabotaging the hostage talks, that he has not wanted a deal from the start. That what would happen is that Netanyahu would come out in public and give some sort of pronouncement of what our latest deal is and what we are prepared to offer Hamas. And then at night, he would call the negotiating team and take it all back and give them a new set of new structure of what we could offer to Hamas that was much, much less than what he had said in public. The idea being that he really wanted to curtail the hostage negotiating team and not allow them to negotiate a deal that would bring the hostages home. And a lot of Israelis suspected that Netanyahu didn't really want a hostage deal to happen, but this sort of confirmed it for a lot of the Israeli population. When you had two negotiators on the team itself saying that they felt their efforts to bring the hostages home have been handcuffed by Netanyahu's hypocritical statements, it really sent a message to Israelis that we don't have a leader right now who has the best interests of the hostages in mind. So that's another factor that we're contending with here is this realization that our own government might not be doing everything it can to bring the hostages home. And that realization that more and more likely is the notion that none will come home at all. So what does this mean for moving forward? Well, a very interesting poll came out this week in regards to Israel's response to Iran. It feels like a long time ago already that we did our sort of emergency session on the Iranian attack on Israel, which was unprecedented. Over 300 airborne drones, ballistic missiles fired at Israeli territory, 99% of which were intercepted by Israel and its coalition of the US, UK, France, and most unlikely of all, Jordan. And yet it is still only less than a week away. And Israel has vowed many times since then to respond, that we are going to respond to this attack by Iran. And many Israelis believe that we should. However, a very surprising poll number was released that said that 76% of Israelis, that's more than three-fourths, so 76% of the Israeli population believes that Israel should not respond in a way that harms the coalition we have with primarily the US, but also the UK, France, and Jordan. So what does this tell us that 76% of Israelis that hitting back at Iran hard is actually not our first priority? Our first priority is to preserve the coalition that we have. I think a lot of Israelis are looking back at our response to October 7th and realizing that perhaps we moved forward a bit too quickly without the full support of the world behind us in a way that we could have had, and that we need to do it differently this time. I think Israelis are realizing that merely hitting back at Iran to teach them a lesson isn't nearly as important as creating something viable for Israel's future in the long term. And I really want to make clear here the difference in consciousness that is happening and how different this is from the traditional Israeli consciousness when it comes to how we deal with our enemies. The traditional way of thinking about our enemies in the Middle East is that we need to deter through strength. that the best defense to any possible attack by our enemies is through showing overwhelming force and really frightening our enemies into not attacking us back or attacking us ever again. And really, the Israeli mantra has always been about strength and power and what we can show our enemies. We've talked about this idea before here on Inside Israel. How how much it's been tied up into the Israeli ethos to display our power and our raw strength. Retribution is a very strong quality, a very strong characteristic of Middle East thinking. The idea of not looking weak, the idea of showing strength, these are central characteristics of the Israeli ethos. And you see it on a personal level too. Um, I've often remarked about how Israelis really don't like to apologize. And it's true. As someone married to an Israeli, I can tell you Israelis don't like to apologize so much. I'm from the Midwest, where it's sort of in our blood to apologize all the time. We like to smooth out situations, avoid conflict. Israelis, their first instinct is not to apologize. And the reason is that in the Middle East, when you're surrounded by enemies, you never want to look vulnerable. And looking vulnerable makes you look weak. You never want to show weakness to the enemy, and therefore you don't apologize. And by the same idea, if the enemy hits you, you need to hit back not twice as hard, but 10 times as hard because you don't want to look weak. So the idea that three-fourths of the Israeli population is now saying not looking weak is actually the second most important characteristic. Preserving our coalition with partners is most important of all. I cannot emphasize enough how much this is a change from the old Israeli consciousness. And I think the reason is that Israelis are realizing we have to play the long game here. We could certainly hit back hard militarily on Iranian targets. We could destroy military assets. We could go after segments of the civilian population. We could have one of those huge displays with mushroom clouds and loud explosions that shock the Iranian people and certainly the Iranian leadership. But Israelis are saying there might be something more important here, the long-term viability of Israel, which is most safeguarded by some sort of coalition against Iran in which we use sanctions instead of explosions, and we use pressure instead of attacks on military or civilian targets. It's very different for Israelis to think this way, but I think it does signal that we realize how important this coalition is, and also a new idea in Israel, which is that we cannot go at it alone. I think if one thing we certainly have learned from the October 7th attacks and our response is just how important it is to have America not just with us, but behind us. And the growing realization that we cannot take America's support for granted. And that's reflected in these poll numbers, this fact that 76% of Israelis see preserving the coalition as the most important thing when it comes to taking action in response to Iran. So those are the three narratives related to this question of who knows 133, what happens to the hostages, and what happens as we look back in retrospect. And as those of you who saw in the newsletter I sent out yesterday, Hebrew is Magic, the idea of retrospect is an important one here, this idea of looking back, and it is in fact tied into Passover. One of the big words we're going to say at the Seder next week is avadim, which means slaves. Avadim hayinu lepa'o b'mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And as I point out in yesterday's newsletter, the word avadim is based on the root, the shoresh eved, ayin bet daled, which means slave. Avadim is just the plural of slave. But there's another word in Hebrew that also comes from this same root, eved, and it's the word bediavad, which means in retrospect. And it's really fascinating that the Hebrew word for looking backwards in retrospect comes from the same root as the word slave. That literally the word retrospect is based on ayin bet daled, the word slave. That in Hebrew, there's a connection between slavery and looking back. And I think the idea here is that sometimes You can easily be a slave to your past if you're not careful. That looking backwards, the easiest thing you can do is simply to repeat what you've done before. And Israelis are saying we don't want to be slaves to our past. We don't want to simply respond hard against Iran because that's what we've always done. We've always responded with these huge, brilliant displays of strength and power. We need to think differently because in the long term, we actually might have an opportunity here, an opportunity to change the Iranian leadership. 80% of Iranians do not want the Iranian leadership in power, do not support the current Iranian leadership. And also, we might have an opportunity to bring down Iran's nuclear program, which would benefit obviously not just Israel, but the rest of the world, our coalition included. We don't want to blow this opportunity. We might have had an opportunity for some different outcomes in Gaza had we responded differently after October 7th. We don't want to be slaves to our past in the same way we were before. And we have a new opportunity here. So that is what that 76% number, I think, means. In terms of some other news coming out of Israel this week, there really wasn't any huge news, no huge event. It's a lot of waiting. So far, Israel has not attacked Iran, has not taken any action in response. We all do believe that some action will happen, but we don't know what it is. And as I said last week when we met after the attack by Iran on Israel, this isn't over for Israelis. There's another word I'll bring in here. The word in Hebrew for victory is nitzachon. Nitzachon is the Hebrew word for victory. And the root, the shoresh of that word is netzach, nun tzadi chet, which means forever. In Hebrew, the idea of victory, it's really not a victory until it lasts forever. Victory is based on the premise of it lasting, if not forever, then for a very long time. So that's why many Israelis are not looking at our thwarting of the Iranian attack as a victory, because we don't think this is over. This is not forever just quite yet. Many of us are thinking that there could be a second Iranian attack that comes unprovoked. Iran is saying over and over that they will respond to the tiniest act of Israeli aggression. We had an Iranian official yesterday say that they are examining or re-examining their nuclear doctrine. What does that mean? It means that Iran is basically saying that until now, our nuclear facilities were all developed for the point of peaceful purposes, that our nuclear program was put in place for peaceful reasons, for energy, etc. Now, I don't believe that, and most people don't believe that, but what they're saying is that we are now re-examining our nuclear doctrine, meaning at this point, we would now consider using our nuclear capabilities for military reasons against Israel. And they said we know where all of Israel's nuclear targets are, and we would attack them. And there's really not necessarily a reason to believe that they're bluffing here and not telling the truth. Another very important quote that came out of that Iranian leader's mouth was he said that we used our minimum capability to exert the maximum Israeli capability. The idea is that it required Israel's absolute maximum ability to respond just in order to thwart what Iran is saying is a minimal attack. Now, 300 drones and missiles might not sound like a minimal attack, but I assure you, Iran has far more weapons in their arsenal than just what they unleashed the other night. They could have easily overwhelmed our ability to respond had they launched, let's say, 3 or 4 times the number of missiles than they did. We really were stretched to our maximum um, in order to shoot down the 99% of incoming projectiles that we did. So Iran could overwhelm us. A lot of things went right. I would say everything went right the other night when Israel responded with its coalition partners as we did. And that is not a good doctrine of defense, is that everything needs to go absolutely right. Because inherently in warfare, there are going to be mistakes made. We've seen this in Gaza, where about 1/7 of all Israeli soldiers killed in Gaza have been killed by what's called friendly fire. Mistakes happen in war, and you cannot say that everything, 100% of things going right, is what's required for us to defend ourselves. We know that Iran could overwhelm us, and we are, if not expecting, we know it's certainly possible that another attack could come. And certainly, if Israel retaliates in some sort of massive way, or even not a massive way, we believe that we could see more aggression from Iran. Our bomb shelters here still have the food, the canned food, the water, the books, the toys, the blankets, the chairs that we put there last week. This is not a victory. This is not a done deal for Israelis. So even though there was no major news this past week, we're still waiting. That's the big news, is that this isn't done. Another piece of news that came out yesterday is that the United Nations Security Council ultimately did not uh, pass a resolution calling for the Palestinian Authority membership in the UN. This was due to a veto by the United States. And Israel's foreign minister, Katz, gave a very moving speech as to why the PA should not be recognized in the UN. He said, since October 7th, the United Nations Security Council has had no meetings about Israeli hostages. They haven't met once to discuss how to get medication to our hostages, how to get the Red Cross and UNICEF meeting Israeli hostages. Not one time has the UN Security Council met to discuss the Israeli hostage situation. And yet, how many times have they met to condemn Israel? How many times are they now meeting to try to push forth the idea of Palestinian Authority membership in the United Nations? He said it's absolutely ludicrous that this would happen. And while I've said before that I do favor a Palestinian state, hopefully I believe in the near future, simply to separate from them, I also believe that this is not the way that it should happen. It should not happen through the United Nations simply recognizing it without any kind of framework for what that state would look like, that it be demilitarized, who would be in charge, who would help rebuild it. Um, so I think this is good news. It's sad to me that it required the United States to veto it, but alas, PA membership in the UN was not granted. And the another big piece of news that came out of Israel is that researchers at Tel Aviv University found a link between heart disease and, between heart attacks and the growth of cancer. Why do I think this is big news that Tel Aviv University researchers found a link between heart attacks and the spread of cancer? Well, because this is what the world should be talking about when it comes to Israel. The problem with all this, the other problem with all this talk on uh, genocide and starving the Gazan population and humanitarian aid is that Israel's contributions to the world are completely overlooked, and so much of the world simply does not realize how much Israel contributes, not just to the progress when it comes to health and technology, but to the world economy and the growth and well-being of the human population in general. And to me, it's an absolute shame that all of this is lost. And that's why I think this is an important headline, the idea that researchers are making this huge discovery in the field of health, which, I haven't checked American media outlets today yet, but I highly doubt it that that would make it into most coverage in American and world media. You did send in a few questions. I'm going to take them quickly, but what I really want to get to is how to make the idea of hostages a part of your Passover Seders next week, because Passover will be here in a few days. We always say, Manish Tana Halayla Hazeh, how is this night different? And it will be so different from every other Seder. And I'm going to give you some ideas of how to truly make this Passover Seder different from all others. So the first question that we had come in from Harold is, given all of Iran's preparations militarily against Israel over the years, how come this attack was such an utter failure, in which we were able to shoot down 99% of the incoming arsenal, and there was really only one small, two casualties. One, some damage to the Nevatim air base in the south, and the second casualty to the 7-year-old Bedouin girl who is still in serious condition. She was hit by shrapnel after a missile was blown up. So I guess I would just challenge Harold's question that this was an utter failure. So on the one hand, it was. It was an utter failure. I think Iran did not expect that we would be able to shoot down 99% of all the incoming missiles and drones. Um, but I think Iran also knew that they weren't using their full power. One reason we were successful is because of this coalition. And so, to the extent that we did succeed, and we certainly did, it was because we had these partners with us. But to say that it was an utter failure, which I think if it were an utter failure, that would mean that Iran would be deterred from attacking again. I don't know that it is deterred. I think it's now rethinking how it can attack us and how it can show its strength, according to this old Middle East doctrine. But as for why they were not able to hit us, it was because of Israel's Chetz arrow system that we've been developing since the early 2000s, specifically against Iran, and also our partnership, which we could not have done it without. Judith and Harriet wrote in together. They say they are longtime listeners, and they wanted to know about a report on NPR, National Public Radio in the US, that Iran had notified the United States ahead of time prior to their attack. What are Israelis saying about this? What's the Israeli media saying about it? Well, actually, even American officials are denying this is absolutely false, that Iran did not give advance notice to the United States prior to their attack. Iran has been saying a number of things to try to make it seem like they're still victorious. In the Middle East, you're never going to hear anyone admit defeat. You're just going to hear them spin it into some sort of victory. And what Iran is saying is that we didn't want to hit Israel that hard because we didn't want to escalate things too far. That's why we hit with missiles that we knew could be intercepted. That is why we notified the United States ahead of time. Iranian officials, what the Iranian government did is after the attack this past week, they showed footage on television of buildings burning and lots of fires and said, this is what's happening in Israel right now. Well, it's been found that these images of the burning and destruction were taken from television in Chile, some sort of fires they were having there. So, anything Iran can do to try to project the idea of victory, they are doing. But Israel and the U.S. has flat out denied that Iran gave any advance notice of the attack. So that's simply something I wouldn't believe at all. But it doesn't surprise me that NPR is reporting this. I used to listen to NPR. I cannot believe how far they have gone into simply being what I think is a mouthpiece of the Palestinian people and really as anti-Israel in their rhetoric as anyone else. And someone else asked, so Eric asked, how are Israelis celebrating Passover in Israel next week? Well, on the one hand, this is a nice transition into the sort of the tidbits I'm going to give you for how to bring thoughtful conversation into the Seder. On the one hand, it's all systems go in terms of our shopping. It's a very special time to be in Israel right now. Stores paper over all their chametz, their leavened goods. You can't go into a grocery store and necessarily see bread at the same time that you can see matzah. The whole country makes an attempt to be kosher for Passover, and the vibe is in the air. That sort of rush of nervous anticipation as the entire country gets ready for really what is maybe the one of the biggest nights on the Israeli calendar. There's only 2 nights in Israel where it's just known that there's going to be a massive traffic jam on Israeli highways. One of them is Erev Rosh Hashanah, the first night of Rosh Hashanah. Our highways are packed as everyone drives to their various Rosh Hashanah dinners with family all over the country. And the other night, when there's always a traffic jam in Israel, is the first night of Passover. Here in Israel, we only do one Seder. Let me tell you, as someone who lives in Israel, this is a huge relief. This is a great aspect of living here. The fact that you're only doing one Seder, one and done. And most Israelis are shocked, if not horrified, by the idea of 2 Seders. What? Doing it all over the second night again? But on that first night, there will be a traffic jam next week as well. And that energy is in the air as we all get ready for Passover. But at the same time, we are all looking for ways to try to make this Passover different, to truly manishtana halayla hazeh, to make this Seder different from all others. And as you see in the chat, I put our Passover supplement. Benji and I wrote the book Israel 201 together. We created a Passover PDF, which is 2 pages. It's black and white so that you can print that without depleting the ink in your color printer. And my hope is that you can print this out and use it at your Passover Seders. And it's 2 pages, and it contains material that you can use to bring the idea of slavery, freedom, hostages, captivity, into the Passover Seder this year. It contains four more questions for this year's Seder, questions that, in addition to the traditional four questions that you might ask at the Seder table to spark some conversation about what it means to celebrate freedom when those among us aren't free. What does it mean to rejoice at our enemy's downfall? There's a story in Passover that Miriam, after the Egyptians drowned in the Red Sea, Miriam played her tambourine and was rejoicing. Is that appropriate that we celebrate at our enemy's downfall? And there's also some Hebrew magic in there as well, with words connected to the Haggadah and insights we can learn to help make our Seders more meaningful. I think the most important parts of this two-page PDF are, first of all, the Achenu prayer for hostages. That is one thing you should definitely do, I think, at your Seder, is recite the Achenu prayer for the well-being, the safeguarding of the hostages. We put it there in Hebrew, in transliteration, so that if you don't read Hebrew, or those at your Seder don't read Hebrew, you can read it in the Hebrew, or in English. We also put the English translation there as well. So I think that is one of the most important things we can do. Some other ideas that we suggest: one is to tape a piece of masking tape on your Seder plate that says 199. A lot of people wear a piece of masking tape on their shirt with the number of days that our hostages have been in captivity in Gaza. And when the first Seder comes around, the number 199, it's going to be the 199th day that we have had hostages in Gaza. So putting a piece of masking tape on your Seder plate, along with all of the other normal things we put on the Seder plate, with that number 199, is one way to commemorate the hostages being there. Another idea is to put an empty chair at your table. When I was a kid growing up, and I'm sure a lot of you might have done this as well, when we had our bar mitzvah, we put a chair on the bima, the stage in the synagogue, and in my case, we put a talit as well, and the name of a Russian refusenik, someone in Russia who was not allowed to have a bar mitzvah, someone our age, 13, a 13-year-old boy or a 12-year-old girl who wasn't able to have a bar or bat mitzvah in Russia. And that empty chair on the bima reminded us that there are Jews in the world who cannot have a bar mitzvah, and we are having a bar mitzvah for that person as well. And so Benji and I took this idea and applied it to the Passover Seder this year, where you might have an empty place at your Seder table, a chair, even a place setting with the plate and the silverware and a cup of wine, and the name of a hostage on that chair or on that plate. If you want to take a step further, you could have everyone at your Seder come to the Seder with the name of a hostage and a few pieces of biographical information about that hostage, his or her name, how old they are, some of their hobbies. Try to put a face on this hostage and make us realize who they actually are, and do the Seder for them as well. The one thing we cannot do is simply let them be allowed to be called the hostages and sort of dismiss them with that label. We have to keep them front and center as human beings who have faces and names, who are in the most horrible conditions imaginable, those whom are still alive. And I think an empty place at the Seder table, with their name and some biographical information, if you can, is another way to commemorate them, and that we're thinking about them as well. We offer a few other suggestions, like turning off the lights if you use electricity on Shabbat, and doing part of the Seder in the dark, turning off the AC or the heat just to be in less than ideal conditions. And maybe a harder thing that you might do, and that I'll conclude with, is not having dessert at your Seder. One of the biggest parts of the Passover Seder is tzafun. That's the toward the very end. Right before tzafun, then we have barech, halel, and yirtzah. So the conclusion of the Seder meal is tzafun, dessert. And we always look forward to it. When I was a kid, I sold Passover candy, and it's amazing the kind of almond barks and Seder mints, and really the amazing candy we've come up with, and cakes that are kosher for Passover as a way to enjoy dessert at the Passover Seder. But what if we gave up dessert? What if we didn't have that bit of sweetness at the end? I know the Seder would feel incomplete without the dessert, but I think would also remind us that this Seder is not complete until all of the hostages come home. I personally will not be having dessert at this year's Seder. And How does it connect to Hebrew? Well, I mentioned the word for dessert is tsafun, tsadi pe vav nun. But tsafun comes from the root tsafan, tsadi pe nun, and that's also the same root as the word matspun, which is Hebrew for conscience. Our conscience, that voice inside us that tells us what to do, the difference between right and wrong. It has the same shorish, the same root as the word for dessert. And in my case, I think there's a connection here. I think that at the end of the Seder, as we have dessert every year, this is a chance for us to think about what is the new year going to be like. The real Rosh Hashanah, the real new year actually begins at Passover. The Rosh Hashanah that we traditionally have in Judaism in September, that's actually the seventh month of the Jewish calendar, Tishrei. Passover is seen as the true first month of the Hebrew New Year, the true beginning. And this is a time for us to get in touch with our own consciousness and our consciences and say, what do we want to do differently in the year to come? And not having dessert as we conclude the Seder is one way to reorient ourselves toward thinking about the hostages, thinking about the plight of our brothers and sisters who are not free as we celebrate this holiday of freedom. I want to thank you for joining me this week. Someone asked that I please repost the link. So if you want the PDF Passover supplement, the easiest way, go to joelchasnoff.com. There'll be a pop-up on the home page where you can download it. You can also download it right here. I'm going to put it as a document from my that I'll simply upload. So hang on one second. You can grab it now. That's another way you can grab it, is just click that PDF link that I just put in the chat. Someone else offered the idea of putting a yellow ribbon around everyone's Kiddush cup. Yeah, another excellent idea. And I encourage you to come up with your own. Just send me what they are. I would love to hear next week when we meet what you did at your own Passover Seders. In terms of next week's episode, I'm planning to do it on Wednesday night. That's the 24th. This is the conclusion of, you know what? That'll be still Chag on the West Coast. So I think we'll have to go with Thursday. So let's go with Thursday night, the 25th, again at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm still trying to figure out what's better, 9 p.m. or 8 p.m. Eastern Time. A lot of people wrote in saying that they did want 9 p.m. Eastern, and yet maybe it's not the best. So let's go with 9 p.m. next Thursday, the 25th, for our next episode of Inside Israel. And then after Passover, we'll get back on our regular Monday or Tuesday night schedule. Until then, I wish all of you a Chag Sameach, a holiday of questions that we grapple with but not necessarily answer, and Rak Shalom, only peace to everyone. I'll leave the chat open for a couple minutes. Signing off from Israel, everyone. Thanks for joining.